There are some seats in the front. Dear students, colleagues, and esteemed guests, I welcome you all to the 13th Handel Foundation Endowed Faculty Chair Lecture. This endowed chair was created by Shirley and Vern Handel to perpetuate the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Shirley and Vern are right there. I can see them. And I want you to, I want to thank them for their continued support for Dutchess Community College. Let's give them a hand. Another sponsor of this lecture is the Student Government Association. So students, give yourself a big hand for co-sponsoring this event. I also want to acknowledge the members of the Department of History, Government, and Economics, the Vice President of Academic Affairs, Dr. Alan Gambino, Dr. Holly Malala, Dean of Academic Affairs, members of the college community, our students, and our guests who are attending today's lecture. A special thank you to Diana Pola, Executive Director of the DCC Foundation, and to Mike Vida, the Director of Student Activities, for putting together this wonderful event. Last but not least, a special thanks to Doug Lycan and Jeff Butler for the light, sound, and live streaming of this event. On April 14, 1938, in one of his fireside chats, President Roosevelt spoke about the economic conditions that prevailed at that time. He said, and I quote, "I am constantly thinking of all our people, unemployed and the employed alike, of their human problems of food and clothing and homes and education and health and old age. I know these are the things that decide the well-being of all our people," unquote. The well-being of people, and particularly the well-being of families and communities of all stripes in America, is what our speaker today, Dr. Dorian Warren, has been writing and researching, speaking and advocating for. In a recent article in the Huffington Post, Dr. Warren urged the 2016 presidential candidates to step up to the plate to offer bold solutions to fix the economy and help struggling American families. He wrote, "Far too long, politicians have made promises to America's struggling families. Long-term and historic disparities cannot continue if we want an America that works for everyone. It is time to find another way," unquote. Dr. Warren is a scholar of inequality in American politics and has taught in the University of Chicago and at Columbia University. He is a fellow at the Roosevelt Institute, the board chair of the Center for Community Change, and the host and executive producer of Nerding Out, a program on MSNBC's digital platform. Mr. Warren was born and raised in Chicago. You all know another Chicagoan who used to be a community organizer and is now in the White House. Professor Warren received his BA from the University of Illinois and his MA and PhD in political science from Yale University. His research and teaching interests include labor and community organizing, race and ethnic politics, African American politics, and urban politics and policy. It is my great honor to introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Dorian Warren.
Good afternoon. Hey, anybody out there? Good afternoon. Okay, we're going to try this a third time. Ready? Good afternoon. Oh, there we go. Okay, we're all awake. Great. Thank you so much first to Professor Simi Ahmad for inviting me here. It is quite an honor, and especially to be sponsored by the Handel Foundation Endowed Faculty Chair to perpetuate the legacy of Franklin Eleanor Roosevelt, which obviously speaks very much to my heart as I am a fellow at a place called the Roosevelt Institute, where we are charged to carry forth the legacy and values of the Roosevelts into the 21st century. So it's quite an honor to be here and to share some thoughts, some arguments, hopefully some controversial and provocative arguments with you about the state of our country and where we're going. And then I think we'll have some time for discussion afterwards, although you should feel free to, if you have a question, I'm happy to be interrupted, so don't feel bashful. The story I'm going to paint isn't necessarily a rosy or uplifting story, although I'll try to get there by the end of the presentation. It's really a story of what's happened in this country over the last 30 to 40 years in terms of opportunity and inequality, and trying to understand what are the causes of, in some ways, the dangers and the loss of parts of the American dream over the last 30 to 40 years, and how can we envision changing the rules to ensure and open up greater opportunity for all Americans, but particularly I'm going to talk a bit about African Americans and poor Americans this afternoon. So I'd like to start with history, because over the last several years we've been celebrating many significant anniversaries. So a few years ago we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the 1963 March on Washington at the height of the Civil Rights Movement. People often forget that it was a march on Washington for jobs and freedom. It's the full title of that march. We then celebrated the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was probably the biggest and most significant legislative accomplishment of the Civil Rights Movement, along with the 1965 at the bottom there, Voting Rights Act, which ensured the right to vote for all Americans, and particularly for Black Americans, for the first time ever in our country's history. Does anyone know, this is sort of a pop quiz, so the 1964 Economic Opportunity Act, does anybody know what that is? What we often call that, or what that piece of legislation was? Anyone under, let's say, 40, do you know what that is? And especially if you didn't hear the young lady up front. What were you going to say, sir? Close. It wasn't affirmative action. Affirmative action came slightly earlier in the Kennedy administration. It was an executive order. But I think some people heard your answer, so let's go for it. Ending poverty. All right. So the 1964 Economic Opportunity Act was the launch of what was called the War on Poverty. And when President Lyndon Johnson launched the War on Poverty, the goal was to end absolute poverty in America by the bicentennial, which would have been 1976. That was the goal. We were going to end poverty in America by 1976. So I'll come back to this point in a few minutes, but obviously we didn't quite accomplish that goal. And in fact, we don't aspire to that goal any longer, it seems. So the 64 Economic Opportunity Act, or the War on Poverty, we also celebrated the anniversary, the 60th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, which ended racial segregation in public education. And then last year we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. So huge legislative victories, in one case a court case, to advance equity and racial equality in this country. And I want you to think about, keep these in the back of your mind over the next 20 minutes or so, and think about the progress and lack of progress we've made since these legislative achievements. Because I want to suggest by the end that we have to reimagine what these would look like for our day and time right now. What should be the new rules that include more people in the economy and in the society at this moment of our country's history. So maybe many of you have seen some of these slides. I'd like to overwhelm you with data and charts, so I'm going to have a lot of charts I'll try to get through very quickly, and you've probably seen many of these. But the story you've heard probably the last couple of years is that as a country we have grown much more unequal. over the last 30 years. And in fact, the levels of inequality in America in terms of income and wealth are at historic highs. In fact, income inequality is as high as it is now since right before the Great Depression in the first part of the 20th century, as you can see there. So this is a chart of the top 1% and how much the top 1% took home in terms of national income. And you see it has a U shape, right? And so many of you that probably have been in economics classes have seen these charts. But it has a U shape. So essentially the middle part of the 20th century, you see the top 1% took home less national income. That is a period in American history in terms of the 20th century of greater equality. That's the period where we actually grew a broad and large middle class, where we had shared prosperity and less equality in terms of income, not other dimensions. So the middle part of the century, from roughly 1945 to about 1975, the top 1% took home less national income, but as you see, starting in the late 70s and then, of course, the 80s, 90s, it increases. Or to put it a different way, here is average household income by top 1%, as you see the red line, and then you see everybody else whose incomes from roughly 1980 through the first decade of the 21st century incomes were flat for everybody else. So everyone else has been treading water, but the top 1%, if you're lucky enough to get there, you're doing really well. Everybody else, as in the 99%, I guess it's called, right? You've heard that before? Everyone else is not doing so well in the economy the last 30, 40 years. And for New York, it's even more stark. So in 2012, in New York City, the top 1% took home 40% of the city's income. Top 1% in New York City took home 40% of all the income generated in the city. So striking levels of inequality. You might want to ask yourself, well, maybe, the top 1%, maybe they deserve it. They work really hard. Or you could ask, well, what are the consequences of such unequal distribution of income? And we have some answers now from social science research. We actually know the more unequal societies are, the less economic growth they achieve, both within the United States as well as other societies. At the same time, I'd like to point out rates of poverty. Since we declared a war on poverty in 1964, rates of poverty are still too high and are still with us. This is a chart of poverty by race and ethnicity, so white, black, Hispanic. On the left-hand side, those are adults. So about 10% of white Americans live under the poverty line, about a quarter of African Americans, about a fifth of Hispanics. But if you look all the way to the right, and you look at child poverty, you'll see 40% of African American children live in poverty in this country, and 1 in 3 Hispanic children live in poverty in this country. Does anyone know, by the way, what the official poverty line is? You had a guess? 15? And is that for one person, 2 people, or 4 people? 4-person family. So it's about 15,000 for a family of 2. And so everybody was right, by the way, essentially, because for a family of 4, it's about 22,000, roughly. So one of the troubling things that we have seen in the data is that with increasing income inequality over the last 40 years, with very stubborn poverty rates, it would be one thing if this was unrelated to economic opportunity and mobility. But we're now learning that income inequality, rates of poverty, are actually directly linked to your likelihood to move up and down the economic ladder. So let me explain what I mean by that. There's something that we call economic mobility, social mobility, or simply just the American dream, right? The idea that if you're born poor in this country, you have a chance, if you work hard, to make it to the working class or the middle class, or you get to maybe be rich even. If you're born middle class, or if you're born rich, you might stay there or you might fall, depending, but the dream, right, the central idea of a meritocratic society is that if you work hard, that'll determine your station in life, not where your parents are in terms of the income spectrum, right? So again, if you're a poor kid, do you end up staying poor, even if you work really hard? Or do you have a chance to make it to the working class? So here's what the data tells us. There is a period in American life, so 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, up to 1980, when we saw increasing economic mobility. That is, more and more people had access to the middle class, or to even becoming rich. This number, there's a number social scientists use. It has a fancy name. I don't need to get into that, the technicalities. But essentially, think of it from 0 to 1. The lower the number from 0 to 1, the more mobility we have in the society. The more likely your parents' station in life won't determine yours. The more opportunity we have. The closer we get to 1, the less mobile the society, less opportunity. So as you see, going into the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, that number was going down, which was a good thing. We were getting more mobility. More and more people had access to the rungs into the middle class. And then something happened, something changed, so that by 1990 and 2000, by this chart, we became less mobile, opportunity hardened. We lost some rungs in the ladder of mobility. And again, you might want to ask yourselves, why is that the case? What changed? What happened? What's the story of why our society has become more unequal, less opportunistic, why is the American dream fading, is the question, yeah? This is a similar chart of data. This is the share of income in the bottom fourth, ending up in either the bottom or the top fourth. So in other words, if you're born poor, do you end up staying poor over your lifetime? Versus do you make it into the middle class or even the top 10%? What this is showing you is for 2 out of 3 black children who are born poor in this country, they end up staying poor. They never make it into the middle class or higher. And for a third of white children, for a third of all white children born poor in this country, they end up staying poor. So in an America where we imagine the American dream is alive and well, the data actually show us that for millions and millions and millions of children, white and black children, particularly black children, their life chances are determined by their parents' station in life. That's what the data are showing us. And again, the question is why? We also know, as I've been trying to paint a story of an America that's become more unequal in the last 30 or 40 years, we also know compared to other places in the world, other countries in the world, our inequality also breeds other kinds of problems. So this is an index of health and social problems mapped on income inequality. So there's an index of life expectancy, what are math and literacy rates of a society, how about infant mortality rates in a society, or homicides, imprisonment, teenage births, trust, obesity, mental illness, drug and alcohol addiction, social mobility. So there's an index that social scientists create to measure all of these dimensions of a society, of well-being, of life. And so when you map it, you see the U.S. is all the way up there by itself in the right-hand corner. We're very high on income inequality, and we're very high on a range of social problems as well. We have some of the highest rates of infant mortality of any rich democracy in the world. And we have the highest incarceration rates. I'll come back to that. We have the highest rates of obesity. We have the lowest levels of trust in society. We have the highest rates of mental illness of most rich democracies. So there is something going on, and social scientists are trying to parse the reasons why. There's something going on between income inequality and a range of other social problems. And frankly, and we can talk about this in the Q&A, I think we're seeing it show up in our political election season right now. That's a teaser. Okay, so there's a puzzle I've been trying to paint a picture of growing inequality and less social mobility in American life and society today. And the question is why? What explains what's happened? Because we also know a world from roughly the post-World War II era of 1945 to the mid-1970s where we were going in a different direction. It was a different America. We were expanding opportunity. We wrote new rules and laws which were much more inclusive for poor Americans and for African Americans in particular, for immigrants, and we've gone in a different direction. So why? And especially in terms of income inequality and economic inequality, there's some common explanations. One is an education explanation, which is partly true. There's something called skills bias technological change. So the jobs that we're creating require a different set of skills these days than in jobs we created, say, in the middle part of the 20th century. We don't have factory jobs or manufacturing jobs as much anymore. How many people know how to code? Can you create an app? I know I can't. I don't have those skills, right? But imagine that those are some skills needed for future jobs, right? In terms of Silicon Valley out west, right? There's a different set of skills. So how do we educate folks? That's why you're here, after all, right? How do you get the skills and human capital for jobs of the future? Especially because this is was an IBM town, right? IBM is no longer here. Well, not like it was, right? Not like it was. I'm glad to hear IBM is still here a little bit, but it's not like it was, right? This town was built on IBM. And that's partly related to the second reason, globalization and what people call the structural transformation of the economy. So we're all participants in globalization. It is the case that many jobs have left America, and you hear candidates on both sides of the aisle saying this, right, the president. Through trade policy, we've lost a lot of jobs where manufacturers could find workers who would work for less in other parts of the world. So there's been loss to America, there's been job loss, but there's also gains, there's consumer benefits. Who has a smartphone? All the students do, right? Right, that's the benefit of globalization. We're connected in a way we've never been before. And there's trade-offs, and we can argue about that, but that's another explanation for growing inequality, that we live in a globalized world. It's affected our economy in a way that has been, some would say, bad for American workers, for many American workers. There's also this notion of changing social norms. So I'll show you a chart in a few minutes, for instance, of the ratio of average worker pay to CEO pay, which used to be reasonable, I would argue, and now is obscene, not because CEOs today are smarter than their peers from 20 years ago, or actually are better CEOs, but because they can rig the rules to get paid a lot of money. That's a changing social norm. There's been a norm change in terms of what we agree implicitly is acceptable, right? It's not legislation, it's just a social norm. So now we say, oh yeah, so the McDonald's CEO should get paid 600 times the average McDonald's employee, and that's okay with us. We didn't think that 20 years ago. 30 times the pay of the average worker, sure, maybe 50 times, 600 times, that's kind of, right, there's something that's changed. So that's another explanation. All of these, which are partly true, but there's no sense of agency here. It's sort of like, oh, globalization is just kind of out there and it happens. We're changing social norms. We don't exactly know how they change over time, right? So rising inequality and even our economic crisis of the Great Recession hasn't just happened because of abstract social forces. They've happened because we've made political and policy choices as a society to create an America where our economy isn't growing as fast and where there's more inequality. And so we like to, at the Roosevelt Institute, think of the economy like this. There's the tip of the iceberg of the economy, the daily experience, we'd say, of inequality, jobs that don't pay enough to live on, rising living costs, deep anxiety that most Americans have about their lives, about their futures, about their children's futures, So that's at the tip of the iceberg, the daily experience of living at a moment of change and of precariousness, of uncertainty. But right below that tip of the iceberg of the economy are the rules that structure the economy. And this is how I think about the world. This is how we think about the world at the Roosevelt Institute. And this is what I'll be emphasizing for the rest of the lecture. So we think that there are rules that structure the economy and create the outcomes that you see at the tip of the iceberg. The outcomes of anxiety, the outcomes of jobs that don't pay enough. These are rules: financial regulation, corporate governance, tax structure, international trade and finance agreements, macroeconomic policy, labor law, labor market access, and structural discrimination. These are all rules that we create through politics mostly in our political system, but they're rules that we've created over time throughout our history